Ms. Claire Hitchens, and on behalf of Wilfrid Laurier University Press, I'd like to welcome you to the launch of Literatures, Communities, and Learning, Conversations with Indigenous Writers by Aubrey Jean Hansen. This title is in our Indigenous Studies series. We are gathered here online virtually, but I would like to acknowledge that both I and WLU Press are located physically on the traditional territory of the Neutral, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee on the Haldimand Tract, land that runs 6 miles on both sides of the Grand River. We're so pleased to be launching this wonderful book during Indigenous History Month. A couple of housekeeping items, and then I will hand things over to Aubrey. If you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box. We'll try to address any technical issues right away, and at the end of the session, we'll choose as many questions as possible for the panel to answer. Links to the ebook, which is now available from all major vendors, at the reduced price of $24.99 for the launch, will be put into the chat box. The print copy version of the book is expected in about a month's time, so please pre-order from your favorite local bookseller. And now I'd like to introduce Aubrey Jean Hansen, who will be leading today's conversation. Aubrey is a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta and a faculty member at the University of Calgary. Her research spans Indigenous literary studies, curriculum studies, and social justice education, and she is the author of Literatures, Communities, and Learning. Aubrey?
Thank you so much, Claire. It's exciting to be here. Tanshi, everyone. My name is Aubrey. I'm a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta. I'm of Métis and mixed European ancestry, and I'm coming to you from Calgary. As Claire mentioned, I'm currently a faculty member in education at the University of Calgary in the Workland School of Education, and I'm coming to you from the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. I would like to acknowledge the first peoples of this place, the Siksika, Bikuni, and Kainai Blackfoot nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina Nation, the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta. So I want to acknowledge our audience here today. Thank you all for coming. It's incredible to know that there are so many family members, friends, colleagues in the room. Thank you all for your support, and it's wonderful to share this exciting moment with you of launching this book. So I'll tell you a little bit about it before we begin here. Before I came to work in a university setting, I was a high school English teacher in Toronto and Calgary. With that background and with my passion for Indigenous literatures, I came to this project very excited to talk to Indigenous writers about their work and about what it means to them. The book we're launching here today is a collection of my conversations with Indigenous writers. We met on sunny front porches, in offices, in coffee shops, and I asked them to share how they think about their writing and about their communities. Since that time, I've had the pleasure of listening to their words repeatedly, gathering them together into book form, along with my own critical contributions. As all of these authors on today's panel know very well, it takes a great deal of dedication to put a book together, and I want to thank every single one of them for what they've shared with this project. I also want to thank everyone who has helped to make this book happen, particularly my editor, Siobhan McMenemy, and the team at Wilfrid Laurier University Press for their guidance and for understanding and for strengthening what I was trying to do. Thank you also to Claire, who has been with me for this last leg of the journey. Thank you for this event today. I also want to acknowledge the Banff Center for the time and space that I spent there last winter. I was able to complete the manuscript with their support, and I want to thank them for that. Naturally, I also want to thank all my loved ones for their support along the way. Again, one person does not make a book happen. So it's a tremendous honor to be here with a panel of writers today to launch the book together in virtual space, maybe launch it into virtual space. And I want to thank all of you again for being here as an audience to support that. So up next, I will introduce our panel of authors who we have the pleasure of joining us with today. And I'll give a little introduction to each of them, and then we'll move on to the question portion of the event. So David Alexander Robertson is a member of the Norway House Cree Nation and lives in Winnipeg. He's of Cree, Irish, Scottish, and English ancestry. He is the author of numerous books for young people, including the graphic novel series 7 Generations, A Plains Cree Saga, and the Reckoner novels Strangers, Monsters, and Ghosts. Welcome, David. Katharina Vermette is a Métis writer of Métis and Mennonite ancestry with deep roots in the Winnipeg area where she lives today. She's published 2 books of poetry, North End Love Songs and River Woman, as well as the novel The Break. She has also worked in film, creating a documentary work called This River, for instance, and she has created books for young people, including the graphic novel series A Girl Called Echo and the picture book The Girl and the Wolf. Welcome, Katharina. Warren Carey was born into a family of Métis and European ancestry in Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan, and now lives in Winnipeg. He's the author of a pair of novellas entitled The Exalted Company of Roadside Martyrs and a memoir, Lake of the Prairies, as well as a number of short stories. He's also known for his editorial works such as the collection Manitowabao, Aboriginal Stories from the Land of Water, and for his explorations of petroleum culture through petrographs, which are photographs created using bitumen. Welcome, Warren. Lee Miracle is Stolo and was born in North Vancouver. As a traditional teacher in residence at the University of Toronto's First Nations House, she now lives in Toronto. Lee is the author of multiple novels, including Raven Song and Celia's Song, as well as collections of poetry, essays, and oratories, including Bent Box and Memory Serves. From her first book in 1975, Bobby Lee Indian Rebel, up to her recently published book of poetry, a collaboration with her daughters called Hope Matters, Lee has had a long career as a writer. Welcome, Lee. Finally, Daniel Heath Justice is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and was born and raised in Colorado. His work in the university drew him north of the Medicine Line, and he now lives in the Vancouver area. He has published a 3-part epic fantasy called The Way of Thorn and Thunder, The Kinship Chronicles, a number of short stories, and a cultural history called Badger. He's also known for the scholarly book Why Indigenous Literatures Matter, published with Wilfrid Laurier University Press in 2018. Welcome, Daniel. So there's a lot more that I could say about each of these authors, about their academic and professional roles, about the prizes and recognitions they've received, their other published creative work and critical work, but I've given you a bit of a brief introduction, and we're glad to be able to hear more from each of you on the panel through this event today. I want to thank all of you for being able to be here with us. Again, perhaps a little special affordance allowed by the strange environment of Zoom, this virtual launch. It's great you can be here. So we're going to move on now to the questions for panelists. We'll ask them to join us with their cameras. And what I'm going to do is I have a couple of questions, and I'll ask a question, and then I'll just ask each of the authors to take a minute or two to respond. So we'll just go in the same order that I originally interviewed you for the book, which is David, then Katharina, Warren, then Lee, then Daniel. Is everybody ready? Have we got cameras and we're good to go? Awesome. Okay, well, we'll get started. Wonderful to see everyone. I'm sure that the audience is excited as I am to hear you speak and think with us today. So the first question. Thinking of one of your literary works, who do you hope is reading or listening to that work, and why? So David, I'll invite you to go first. Thanks.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me on. Congratulations to Aubrey on the book. And I don't know, I mean, I write a number of different kinds of books. For what I want to say and accomplish with my work, I focus in on trying to hit all segments of the population. So whether it's picture books or graphic novels or novels, because I think it's important that these stories are heard, and not just my stories, but stories by Indigenous writers, stories from writers that are members of marginalized communities. These are the stories that are most important to hear right now and read, and for a number of reasons. One of them is because we grew up without these truths. When I was growing up, I knew of a handful of Indigenous writers. One of them, Lee Miracle, Beatrice Mausenier, Thomas King, otherwise there was so many more forms of literature, areas of pop culture that were misrepresenting Indigenous people. And as I grew up and learned more and more about what it means to be Cree for me, I thought more and more about the importance of having access to truth, especially for kids. So I suppose my answer would be that it's most important for me to hit the young population because they are our future leaders. And I think one of the responsibilities that we have as writers and educators is to equip them with the knowledge that they need to be able to lead us in a better way. Because we are in the situation we are in today because we weren't prepared or educated enough and so my hope is that with more Indigenous writers becoming successful, with more Indigenous writers feeling empowered to tell their stories, that we'll see, a different reality in 20 to 30 years. And so that's kind of the hope I have with my work, is to have some small part of that movement to educate. And I think that education happens primarily through stories. It always has, and I think it always will.
Thanks so much. Katharina, who do you hope is reading or listening to your work, and why? I'm sorry, you're still muted.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I told myself I wasn't going to do that. Totally did.
No, today it's okay.
And again, too, congratulations, Aubrey. This is a beautiful book, and it's like gorgeous cover. And I'm happy to be here. And hello, everyone. And hello, Lee. So nice to see your face. Been a long time. Too long. So who do I think who do I want to, sorry, I forgot the question.
That's fine. So if you think maybe of one of your works, who do you hope is reading that work, and why?
Well, my first readers are always those in my community, those who I'm writing about. I always get, and I'm writing about Indigenous women, or women who are in the inner city, and we are, and that's who I get to read the books first, just to, one, make sure I'm doing it right, one, make sure I'm, representing accurately, and, because they would be the first ones to beat me up if I was, getting something wrong. But I also fully understand that those aren't necessarily the people who need to read what I'm writing about, particularly I'm thinking of my hard novels for this, because sometimes when you live that experience, you don't necessarily need to also read that experience. And contrary to that, sometimes it's very validating to read a story that you can relate to very fully. But when I write about trauma, I totally understand that some people don't need to read that because they've already lived that. So then I think of my readers as the people who need to understand, and the people who need to understand that however that might be defined, is the people that need to understand what it is to live like a marginalized inner city Indigenous woman, what it is to experience growing up in a place where there is many, many dangers, what it is to live with a family that, loves and supports you and knows how to bring you through that experience because they are the experts who have already gone through that. So yeah, I guess that's kind of answering your question, I hope. Yeah.
Definitely, thank you. Warren?
Thanks, and I just want to echo congratulations on the book, and it's absolutely beautiful. I'm looking forward to holding it in my hands and reading these conversations in more detail. For me, most of my work is set in my hometown in Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan, and when I think back on starting out as a writer, I actually was really, in some ways, writing for people from my hometown because I didn't see it represented anywhere. Because I remember, growing up, feeling like I lived in a place that no one cared about, and within the community itself, it's a very complex community. And one of my books, Like the Prairies, is about that complexity and the way in which settler colonialism structured violence in the community, and how I was unwittingly connected to that without understanding it. And so I guess in some ways for me, a lot of my work is really directed toward people who are like the folks in my community, who are, including myself, who are open to understanding or thinking about what's beyond my view, what perspectives are sort of just outside of where I see my community and myself. How can I expand my knowledge of where I am and what it means to be where I am, what it means to be able to say that I belong. or on the other hand, what it means to be connected to something or to some structure or some process that is actually disenfranchising people as well. Maybe I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Lee, I'll invite you to answer next. Who do you think about when you're thinking about your readers? And you're still on mute.
I haven't heard much of what anybody said because for some reason they keep cutting out. I don't know why that is. Not that it matters. My answer probably hasn't got anything to do with what they've just said. The works, I write really different works. One of them is totally oral. So I would like Indigenous people to read that because it shows our orality in the beginning. Now, first of all, somebody mentioned that they weren't educated when they were young. I was extremely educated. I did not go to residential school, and I was educated by a dozen elders and a white guy named, oh God, what's his name? Cecilia's father, Haig Brown, Cecilia Haig Brown's father. So I did know about Canadian law, and I did know about Indigenous law. I knew about Indigenous oratory. I knew about Indigenous theory. I knew about Indigenous thought. I knew about Indigenous story. I knew about European story. I started reading library books when I was 13. I had read 5,000 books by the time I was 19. And I was in fact called an extremely knowledgeable woman by Duke Redbird, who met me when I was 20. So I don't think everybody was not knowledgeable, but what we didn't have then is a place to put that knowledge. Those of us that weren't knowledgeable were severed from their knowledge. They were cut off from it. That's what residential school was all about, and that's what day school was all about. That's what child removal is all about. It's cutting us off from our historical knowledge. So that happened. And Memory Serves is about my historical knowledge, about my oratory, about my sensibility, about the Stalo people and the way we are and the way we think. And it's done in a series of speeches that I made. Somebody taped those speeches, and then we transcribed them, and then we edited them. We edited them orally. My publisher is so wonderful. She sat there with her machine typing away as I was talking. What you get from that is our oratory is both powerful and brilliant and wonderful. And we need to have that in order to be able to write. We do. That has to be our foundation. We don't have that, but we need to get it, and we need to get it back. So that's one thing that I hope. But the other thing I hope is that Canadians are reading my Conversations with Canadians, which is the only one that I actually wrote with them in mind. And it's a series of questions that I've responded to from interactions with audience over the years. I do intend to do my Conversations with Indigenous people next. But there's also something to be said for novels. Celia's Song is a healing novel. Raven's Song is the getting sick novel that precedes it. My poetry is about going into the swamp and coming out again. And of course, Hope Matters is my poetry with my daughters, which is about the history of colonialism and our particular family. All of those things are valuable. The Break is valuable. North End Love Songs is valuable. Every book that we've written, Carey's books are valuable, is valuable for a very specific reason. So I won't entertain the thought of what do I think is the most important whatever. I won't entertain anything most important in the first place, because that's like saying, well, my most important child is my son, or my most important child is my daughter, or the most important young person I know is Katharina Vermette. Even though it might be true, I wouldn't say it. That's not how I am. I think we should think more in terms of what's the value in your work. And I think if you look at what drove you to write it, you'll know the value. The value in my work is that we didn't have a place to put our intelligence. So putting it on paper and putting it in a book made us valuable to them. As an orator, I had no value to Europeans whatsoever. I had tremendous value to my own people, but not to Europeans. And as our kids started going to more and more Europeanized schools, they wanted to see us in a book, or they couldn't see us as valuable. That's part of the colonization, mind you, but I still think that it's important to put ourselves in books so our kids can learn from themselves, to themselves, and then out into the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lee. Daniel?
You know, I kind of want to echo different things. Hey, Lee. I want to echo just a lot of the comments here. I mean, I think I love having anybody read my work. I think it's nice to have people kind of enter your imagination in some way. But I have to say my first readers are the Indigenous nerds. I think, you know, the folks who, like me, you know, maybe raised in community, maybe not like me, but who want to see our own imaginations on the page. And I think that for me, and also kind of the weirdos and the geeks and the eccentrics and folks who kind of are march into a different drum of their own. And especially I think for a lot of us who are Indigenous, who are kind of interested in pop culture and stuff, we don't see a lot of ourselves in pop culture. And so I really hope that my fantasy work speaks to that and maybe shows some different options and ideas for Indigenous readers to maybe see their own imagined worlds on the page. I don't really see a distinction too much between my creative work and my scholarship. I mean, I think my scholarship, certainly my first audience is my family and other Cherokees. And then anybody beyond that. But I think the more we have the opportunity to have our worlds and our imaginations on the page, and where it can inspire other people to do their own work. Like I want to read more of what people have. So I think that would be, for me, I'm always just thrilled when another Indigenous nerd kind of jumps up and say, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know we could do that," or I'm really excited. I've always loved Tolkien, but there were problems with it, and I want to see Indigenous fantasy. So that makes me happy.
That's our original story.
Thank you.
I'm sure many of us here today are happy to count ourselves among the ranks of Indigenous nerds. That's awesome. Thank you. And I'm sure folks listening, I don't know if you've heard me talk about this book before, but if you haven't, I'm sure you're already seeing there's such a richness in these conversations, you know, just with one question opening up the interweaving of story, Indigenous knowledge systems, the significance of literatures to our communities. So there's so much to say along those lines. Just building on the kinds of things that you've all just shared and thinking about readerships, acknowledging that readers might be quite diverse in the ways that you've mentioned. You have Indigenous readers, folks who are of settler backgrounds, people of color, young folks, old folks, with any range of exposure, awareness, familiarity with different knowledge about Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge systems. So thinking along those lines, beyond reading your writing, which of course we hope they're doing, what do you hope that readers will do to learn and engage more with Indigenous communities? And I think we're getting just a little feedback, so if everybody can mute their mics and we'll just go one at a time. We'll follow still the same order. So David, beyond again reading, how do you hope that readers will step into engaging more with Indigenous communities?
Well, I think, you know, reading our stories is a foundation. It builds a foundation, and that foundation of knowledge is important. If we want people to somehow become involved in reconciliation, you know, whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, I think that it starts with creating a base of knowledge, and I do believe that base of knowledge stems from the immersion in story, and so whether they're, you know, oral stories or written stories or film or music, I think that's a starting point. I think that reconciliation itself is a process of sharing knowledge. listening and sharing stories. What I've said often is that, and I think learning how to become involved in a positive way in the process of reconciliation is, first of all, for non-Indigenous Canadians, is to listen in whatever capacity that looks like. So listen with your ears, listen with your heart, listen with your eyes, and because right now we have a platform, as Lee was, I think, alluding to, like we have a platform that we haven't had before. And I think that's very important. This is a very important time, especially within, I would say, the last 10 years, where we have a platform as Indigenous artists to share our stories, where we haven't had a place to put those stories before. And so it's a time now where, we need to be the ones speaking, I think, in this context. But it's a heavy burden at the same time. And I think what that process looks like is to be able to learn enough as a non-Indigenous Canadian to share that burden down the road, so that they can become knowledgeable and able to share that knowledge and be truth tellers. And that, I think that happens in a number of different ways. It comes from sharing stories that we have heard. It comes with showing up to, I think, events. It's holding up each other. I'll give you an example. I was worried going to a protest in Winnipeg this past week for a young girl who was killed by the police. And because I didn't know how much the city cared, to be frank. And when I went to this protest, this rally, there's probably well over 1,000 people who showed up at the legislature. And I don't think you would have seen that 10 years ago. I don't think you would have seen that 15 years ago. I don't think you would have seen that 5 years ago. And so I think that shows that the process of reconciliation is working. But I also think that we need to keep in mind that it's a long process. And so we're just at the beginning of it. But I think knowledge helps us to understand where we need to go and how we need to get there. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but that's what I think I've been thinking a lot about over the past couple of years in the work that I do and what I see happening in Canada today.
Yes, thank you so much. That's wonderful. Katharina.
I am muted. Haha. I love that. I love David, I love the idea of optimism. I'm a little less optimistic, I think, sometimes, but I do think what I really love what's happening in this moment right now of Black Lives Matter and the extensions that's coming in. I love that Indigenous is also included in that, in a way, in Canada. My daughters who are coming into their university years and my nieces are really feel recognized by that, by the fact that this big movement in the States is also extending into the realms of the Indigenous recognition, which they didn't necessarily feel before, and we definitely didn't years ago. Also, I think other than reading my work, like it's great that people are reading books. I love reading books. I read very wide, different kinds of cultures and worlds and fantasy worlds and reality worlds. I think reading broadly is a great way to learn anything. And as well as with Indigenous art in this place now called Canada, we have so much in the visual art world, we have so much in the music world, we have so much in the film world. So it is a lovely moment where there's lots of things to engage in. I think an important part of that is also to support Indigenous artists. I think that's something that people can do to, beyond reading and engaging in this work, is supporting these artists, supporting actual Indigenous artists when it comes to clothing or our art or literature. I think there's many artists out there who aren't necessarily, especially in this time where many of us have lost like so much of our ways of being and ways of making money, because there's no travel, there's so much of nothing. So I think supporting artists is a wonderful way. There's tons of spaces online where you can go and do that and buy things if you have the means to. Also through libraries, if you don't have the means to buy the books. I don't know if all libraries are open across Canada. I don't even know if we're open here. But when they are open, libraries are a great way to support Indigenous writers, because we do get a portion of that when people take out Indigenous authors in books. So that's a great way. And extending, I'm thinking about educators here, because we were talking about educators and you are a former high school teacher, Aubrey. Educators also often have a slush fund or money that they're able to bring in artists and elders and teachers and storytellers, and oral storytellers are wonderful ways to engage young people in culture, all people in culture, but the kids particularly really get so much from those old stories, and they're phenomenally entertaining storytellers out there. So that's another way to support artists and Indigenous art in classrooms, however people can come in through Zoom. But also always remember to pay them, and often, pay them up front. None of this like fill out the form and wait 8 weeks for a check, which many people cannot do not want to do. So I always say, when I always remember the places that were able to pay me up front and on time, and and all of those things. I think it's a very respectful thing to do. Okay.
Thank you so much, Warren.
Unmuted. Okay. Yeah, what very interesting responses already. And I wanted to just pick up on what David was saying about listening, because I think there are so many ways to listen, and there are many ways that we're not really encouraged or trained to listen anymore. And this is something that I've come up against in the work that I've done over the years with Indigenous storytellers. And I've had a great privilege to spend a lot of time with Cree and Métis and Anishinaabe storytellers in particular. And just thinking about the time that I spent with Louis Bird, Mushkigo elder and storyteller, and how when he tells a story, and he's come to my classes and told the stories, the students they're mesmerized, they're engaged with that story in a way that that I can see on their faces, which is something that you can't really watch someone reading a book usually and see that. As a professor, it would be nice to be able to do that. But I think one thing that we, with the students, we all sort of we're trying to come to terms with when Louis would tell the stories and we would talk about the stories later, is we've lost the ability to listen and remember. And this is something that Louis himself has an amazing ability to do. And that is, as Lee has been talking about in relation to all of her work really, but especially oratory, her book Oratory, that is so key to Indigenous ways of being. And I think, to me, for engaging with Indigenous communities, recognizing how our skills at listening have atrophied because of Western culture's fixation on text. I think that's something that we need to recognize. At the same time, I also think that Indigenous literatures can, perhaps paradoxically, can teach us to listen in certain ways, or can at least give us some of the tools so that when we are actually listening to a storyteller or speaking with an Indigenous person, we can sort of get the beginning points of how to listen, how to engage in a way that is different from the way that Western culture generally engages. That is a much more relational, holistic way of being. And I think Lee's work is an amazing example of that. I've learned a lot about how to listen from reading Lee's writing, and so many other Indigenous writers as well, I think, have taught me a lot about how to listen. So that's the one thing that I would contribute.
Thank you so much for that, Warren. And we'll, Lee, invite you to respond next. And you just need, sorry, Lee, I need to ask you to unmute again. So many buttons in Zoom.
I didn't push my mute button. You actually did. So that's why I didn't unmute. You can push my unmute next time. Anyway, I think a number of things. I was trained to listen. The first thing is that we have a self our structure that person that can hear can
Lee, I'm afraid I think you're just cutting out a little bit.
hear and we stop hearing. We stop paying attention because it's nothing to do with us. When we're hearing something that speaks to us, then we can respond and we can take the salient moments in the story and park them next to a point that says, this is who I am. I know Sielt. My Sielt tells me that I am a person that has been here for 15,000 years. My Sielt tells me that there are people buried at the bottom of the Pacific that are my relations. You see that this story starts. I'm parking it where I already stand. So that's what happens to Europeans too. Only they're given themselves and we're given them too. We are not given ourselves. So again, we're still severed from our knowledge. And so it is almost impossible out the context that you are. And we are always going to come out and feel best children to experience, and we still haven't got that. We have. And so she asked me if I'd do a short reading. And a mother looking down at her daughter, and I was thinking of my mother looking down at me. I still you after all this time. That's but it's because it was talking about from me between Katharina and I was this moment of aliveness that I can never forget. I can never forget that moment, and what an honor and a treat it was to read that. And it made the break make sense to me. It made the whole book make sense to me. And so our kids can have that moment too, if they have the stories that say that, like Daniel Justice's stories. If my grandson gets access to that story, he will understand those books. They're fantasy books. We have a fantastic storytelling tradition. And he will be able to relate to those books. He'll be able to talk about those books. It will spark him up like he's never been sparked up at school before. But he's not going to get that because this country is so racist when it comes to us. They don't want us to have us in the classroom. They want us to sit at the back in the dumb seats and be lesser than the European kids. That's what I think. I'm sticking to that story.
Thank you, Lee. Daniel?
I think I'm kind of mixed on my optimism as well. I struggle a lot, but I think one way I would like to see people engage more with Indigenous communities is to engage with more Indigenous voices. I think one of the things kind of historically we've seen is that you know, there are ways in which, you know, a handful of Indigenous people become kind of seen as the representatives. And then, you know, people who've been doing a lot of the work, like I think, you know, Lee is an example of doing amazing work for a long time and kind of being marginalized in a lot of spaces, whereas other people are not. And so what I would like to see more of is more voices in those centers. And, you know, we have an idea that in kind of mainstream Canada, there's a diversity of ways of being Canadian, but there's still a way that indigeneity is kind of figured as a singular thing rather than diverse voices in diverse conversations. So, you know, a lot of news organizations, they have one or two Indigenous reporters to speak about everything that's Indigenous. Well, we actually need a lot of Indigenous voices and a lot of Indigenous writers and a lot of Indigenous reporters and a lot of Indigenous teachers from a lot of different communities to really speak to the fact that Indigenous people are diverse and complex and have a lot of different motivations and a lot of different expectations and a lot of different dreams and hopes and desires. I think a lot of people who think that they are very kind of open to Indigenous people, they're looking for a narrow range of Indigenous people, and typically the Indigenous people who make them feel not bad about colonialism, right? And I think kind of opening up your range and being willing to be critiqued, being willing to be told that, you know, there are really hard and difficult issues and you're actually contributing to them. Looking for, I think if we want to have good relations, and I don't know if I'm uncomfortable with the term reconciliation anymore. Actually, I can say I'm really uncomfortable with the term. But I think there are two different kinds of reconciliation too, right? Like there's the reconcile yourself to colonization reconciliation from the federal government. And then there's the reconciliation that was put forward by Indigenous people, which is a very different kind of process. And that one has truth firmly attached to it. Truth isn't evacuated from it in the way that it is in kind of contemporary political conversations. So for me, the one thing I would want people to get is don't just look for one or two voices, find as many as you can. Find the voices that are challenging each other and contradicting one another or just complicating one another's experiences. Because Indigenous people are in conversation. Why shouldn't non-Indigenous people be in conversation with us as well? And not just one or two people who look good on TV, you know, at a particular moment or on a particular award ceremony, but people actually a wider range of folks who are going to maybe challenge some baseline assumptions, and through that challenge, put us into a more truthful and honest relationship.
Thank you. And I think there's something to me quite significant about partnering that truth piece with the piece about listening. And I can certainly, you know, there's a lot of reading that I recommend to my own students who are future teachers that they can engage with around those topics to confront their own sources of discomfort and to push into those kinds of learning. And I know certainly in the book, there are a lot of conversations that touch on these issues and topics and offer perspectives that are quite pedagogical in nature. Certainly one of the things I noticed in putting this book together was that every writer I spoke to had also been in the past or currently were an educator in some capacity. And that's a really interesting situation, and it makes for a really educational dimension to the book. We have 15 minutes left in our event, and we're gonna add another quick question for the panel before moving on to an audience Q&A. Just wanna flag our audience today, if you do have a question, pop it in the Q&A box. But authors, I wanna ask you kind of a quick one line last question, just because we can fit that in today. Given that educational focus that has come out of the book, I went in with an investment in talking about learning and pedagogy, but also each of you had such rich things to share with me that made me rethink what I knew and push a little further. So thinking about that educational dimension and thinking of those teachers who are either wanting to teach more Indigenous literatures in their classrooms or have recently been mandated to teach more Indigenous literatures in their classroom, and they're engaging in that kind of growth, or perhaps you know, for many it's a passion area to push into that realm of truth and sort of facing these things you've been speaking about. So thinking of K-12 teachers trying to engage with Indigenous literatures, what's one thing you would like to say to folks in that position? And we'll just go again in the same order. So David first, what's something you'd like to tell teachers?
Read the books that you're bringing into the classroom. Learn the history, learn the stories. As much as you want to teach your kids those same stories. I think that's important, that educators educate themselves, and we have to do that too. We have to educate ourselves too before we can talk about these things. And so I think that, because, you know, if I write a story about a Mohawk poet, I need to learn about the Mohawk culture. I'm Cree. So yeah, I would just say read and learn the things that you're teaching your kids, because we've asked teachers to do a very difficult job, and we haven't really prepared them well enough to do it. And so I've met teachers across Canada that are incredible, that want to do this work and want to do it well, but they struggle because it's just the resources or support aren't there. And so a good support our stories, a good support our books. You know, I think that's what I would say. I don't know if that answers it or not, but it's probably, that's more than one line. It's more than one line too. So
well, it depends how you punctuate it, but you're good. That's wonderful. Awesome. Katharina, thanks.
Sorry, I pushed the wrong button. I'm new. So what I want to say to K-12 teachers, right? So many things. Educate yourself as much as possible. I know that it's really hard, and often people are given these quotas to fill in these books, but I mean, spend as much time reading as you possibly can. Educate yourself on the nation of the book and the text that you're taking or you're learning about. Make sure that you know where you're situated in Canada, because I think often, as Daniel was saying, that there's so much, everyone thinks everyone's the same, and that's so incredibly not true. Don't overtax your Indigenous colleagues. I know so many Indigenous teachers who are just getting everything all the time. My husband is one of them, and it's very, very stressful, and there's a lot of learning to be done. And to the administrators, hire more Indigenous educators, because there are simply not enough for the amount of work that everyone is focusing on, especially around Indigenous topics. We need more educators in those schools. I know way too many schools that do not have. Oh, and one more, don't assume that your Indigenous content is for the Indigenous kids alone. The Indigenous kids alone need lots of things to relate to, but every student needs to learn the Indigenous history of this country. Okay, I'll stop now.
That's awesome. Thank you. Warren.
What I would say to teachers is, first of all, thank you for all the incredible, tireless work that you do. Also, though, I guess as a piece of advice, I would say maybe take the opportunity, take the time to question your own assumptions when you're going into reading a work of Indigenous literature or teaching it. And I think it's important to ask the students, or encourage the students to question their own assumptions as well. What are they bringing? What are they expecting from this book? What are they expecting from this story? Because I think we need to, as Daniel was saying, we need to encourage readers to open their horizons to the diversity of Indigenous experience. And I think sometimes, even if people have what they think of as a good intention, and they want to read a work by an Indigenous author, they have a very narrow, as Daniel was saying, a very narrow perspective on that. I think it's important to ask yourself, what am I expecting, and should I have a broader expectation?
Thank you. Lee.
Okay, I didn't hear anything anybody said, including the question.
I can say it
Can't
again
hear
for you. If there's one thing that you would like to say to teachers who are working
Do I need to hear this?
Can you not hear me now? I'll put it in the chat window.
Am I still here? Okay, I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't know what anybody said. Do you want me to just get off?
Can you hear me now, Lee?
Sorry.
Oops. Okay, it looks like we're having, maybe what we'll do, Lee, is circle back while we click some buttons in the background. Daniel, could I ask you to respond to that question if there's one thing that you would like to say to teachers, and maybe we can see what we can do about Lee's sound.
Sure. The one thing I would say is don't let your nervousness keep you from doing the work that needs to be done. I think one thing that happens with some teachers is that they want to do a good job and they don't want to do harm, and they're so nervous that they might do harm that they don't do anything, or they just do the very bare minimum. And I think you're going to screw up. Everybody screws up. We always do. And that's okay. It's what you do. It's what you do on the other end of that, right? So don't let your fear keep you from trying and doing everything you can to bring more Indigenous voices in and to bring more Indigenous content into your curriculum. It's okay to not get it right. It's not okay to not do anything.
I think that's really good advice. And I know one of the pieces that I often offer is maybe starting small, starting with one thing and getting to know it well is a respectable way to begin, rather than trying to go broad without necessarily having a grasp on what we're doing. It looks like we're having a little bit of a tech issue. I think Lee can see us but not hear us. So, how are you doing now, Lee? Can you hear us now? Well, I guess we'd love to hear from Lee on that question. I know certainly when I had the chance to speak with Lee for this book, it was, she taught me so much about what I was doing as a teacher and really made me re-examine my own approaches and think a little with, reframing what I was doing in a way that I found incredibly useful. And I certainly encourage people to read that chapter amidst all the other ones in this book that we're so excited to launch today. Yeah, so I think what we will do is cut to audience Q&A, and I'm just hoping Lee's internet will kind of kick in a little bit, and if she comes back, we'll give her another chance to answer the question. So we do have one question from the audience. I just want to, again, thank everyone for being here. It looks like we have quite a great attendance. And we do have a Q&A box. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask one of the authors today, please just feel free to pop it in that Q&A space, and we'll ask the panel. Lee, how are we doing? Are you hearing us now? No, it looks like no still. I'm sorry about that. That's too bad. The technology sometimes isn't perfect, and we hope it'll open things up rather than shutting them down. But I'm going to turn to, we just have 5 minutes left. So we have one question from a member of the audience who happens to be a close relative of mine. Thanks for coming. The question is, do you think, and this is something that I think many of you with your experience in publishing and the production side of things might want to speak to, but do you think that there will be, or is there now some medium through which we can access Indigenous literatures more easily? So thinking about accessing Indigenous texts, is there something that anyone on the panel would like to respond to?
I'll just say quickly, it's not hard to miss now. I mean, which is a good problem. I mean, as much as we want to have more and more of these books available, and more of our youth and emerging writers and established writers writing more stories, you know, there's now very robust sections in bookstores and libraries of Indigenous literature. There are a number of different publishers that are focusing in on publishing Indigenous books. You know, there are Indigenous book distributors that you can look into, like Good Minds and Strong Nations. There are Indigenous publishers like Thetis Books. Highwater Press is almost solely Indigenous publisher, and so they're out there. Now, I don't know if there's a actual resource that lists all these things, but if you do a bit of looking, you know, luckily today they're easier to find because there's so much more available. But so I don't. But someone correct me if I'm wrong, but that's where I would look anyway.
Yeah. Anyone else want to add to that? Go ahead, Warren.
Sure, I could just thinking about the, you know, that we're doing this over the internet. We're having a great conversation, though I would love to hear more from Lee and hope she can hear us. So there are some difficulties that arise in that, but I'm really looking forward to seeing what Indigenous, you know, creative people are going to do with these technologies. And I'm seeing some of that already with some fantastic you know, blogs and podcasts. And I know David just has a new podcast that I'm really looking forward to listening to. So I think the ways in which digital technology are going to enable us to share our stories in new ways, but also in ways that harken back to our oralities. I think that'll be something that'll be very exciting to see how that evolves over the next generation, really.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'd insert a quick note for my relatives too, that I'm always happy to help them acquire things. Let's try one more time to come back to Lee and give her just a chance if there's anything else that you wanted to add, Lee, to today's discussion. Here we go.
Okay. Tell you that I found consultants and pass and $50. Any Indigenous writer that you want through the internet, but you got to do some home Indigenous writing as much as I can, and I add books to my list. That I have a personal list of books. I know Senator Sinclair has a personal list of books. I don't know who else has personal lists. There's Mukwagis, which Jim Dumont did probably 20 years ago, and I've added to that list as well. But I don't see why we ought to do the research for them to do their job. I really don't want to put this daisy apron on. If they want to know about Indigenous literature, you put Indigenous literature into the search engine, or Native books, or Native writers, or, you know, anybody like that. Start asking publishers. They should start asking, do you publish Indigenous books? And if they don't, they should also ask, why not? You know, like, they should also be helping us to get published. But in any case, I am not going to do the work for teachers. It is their responsibility to find the books. And, you know, Brunelda Wheeler was writing way back in the day too. I know I get cited a lot, but there's 20 writers that precede me. I don't know if any of you can actually name them, but Daniel Justice, you should know some of them because they're Cherokees. Helen Betsy Sutherland, 1735. I mean, holy smokes, guys. We got to know stuff when we're talking to each other, but we don't have to know stuff to help teachers do their job. They should try to find out things. And then they can ask me, is this writer, an Indigenous writer, and I'll say yes or no if I know or I don't know. But ask them for their nation, ask them for their family. And if they have a nation and they have a family, then that's it. That's all you need to know.
Thank you, and I'm glad we got to hear from you. Thank you, Lee. I'm glad we got to hear from you at the end there. We win amidst the Zoom complexities. Well, and it's 5 o'clock already here in Alberta. Not to time travel the rest of you in other time zones, but we have, I don't know about you, I've really enjoyed today's event. I think it's just a little bit of a taster for anyone who wants to hear more. I know that one of the things I've personally found really significant about this is that teachers and educators feel able to step into that responsibility when they have a sense of relationship and possibility with the work. And I just hope, like, this is a humble offering, but I hope that this book gives people a bit of a sense of connection and a place to do that work of listening and wrapping our hearts and minds around the work that needs to come next for those of us who are educators who have more to learn, and I include myself in that category. So again, thanks to everyone for being here today. Thanks to the panel. Thanks to the audience. My heart is so full being able to launch this book with all of you. And I'm going to pass the microphone to Claire to close us out for the day. Thanks so much, everyone. Marcy.
Thank you, Aubrey and Warren, Daniel, Lee, David, Katharina. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. We did record this event. We'll get that link out to you all soon, and have a wonderful evening. Thanks again for coming.